day 14, and happy Valentine's Day. And you guys, today we're going to be reading Harriet Tubman. And yeah, we're actually excited for this book, so let's get started. Okay.
You need to pick up.
I do?
Yes.
Okay. Hi guys, welcome back to the Black Press channel. So today we're going to be reading Harriet Tubman, and I'm actually excited for this book because it's going to be really fun. She's historical. Very historical. Yeah, we're going to be reading Harriet Tubman. Let's get started. Introduction. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross around 1820 on a plantation near Bucktown, Maryland, on the eastern shores of Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay. Her parents, Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross, were slaves. That meant Araminta would be a slave too. She had 10 siblings. Above all else, Araminta wanted her large family to stick together. 2 of her sisters had already been sold, carried off farther south despite their protests and tears. Her mother stood before her as a powerful example of resistance. She had hidden one of Araminta's brothers for a month with friends in the woods from Georgia's slave buyer. From her mother, she learned just how strong a woman could be. As early as age 5, Araminta was hired out to help care for a white baby. At such a young age, she was not at all prepared for reasonability. Her mistress responsibility. Her mistress whipped her 5 times every morning to make sure she did work. 60 years later, she still bore the scars around her neck to prove it. She continued to be hired out to do housework and care for white children on nearby farms. Quick thinking and clever, Araminta soon adopted habits that cleverly protected her against her mistress' whippings. She could wear as much clothing as possible, and when about to receive the usual morning punishments, she would cry out as if she had felt the full force of the whip. By the age of 12, she made the transition from an inside slave to a farmhand. But I did. Farmhand helping with the harvest. But I'm going to read the caption.
Okay.
Born a slave, Harriet Tubman risked her life to bring others to safety and to serve her country as a Union spy. I feel like that's the most popular picture of Harriet Tubman.
It probably is.
But she could no longer defend herself from beatings. When an overseer tried to harm a field worker for deserting his post, Araminta blocked the overseer's path. Her first act was defiance. Her temper raging, he struck her on the head with a piece of iron. Despite the head covering she wore, the wound ran deep, breaking her skull. She was carried back to her owner with a message that she was no longer worth anything. Her family worried she would not recover from the injury. Her owners tried to sell her, but no one offered to buy. Her family's prayers were eventually answered. Although it took months, she healed. However, as a result of the blow, she would fall asleep suddenly several times a day for the rest of her life. Despite the injury, Armenta grew strong. She hauled 4 barrels onto carts.
Flour
barrels onto carts. She was hired out with her father and brothers and cut the whole timber. Soon she was chopping more wood than most men. She exceeded what was assumed to what she expected of her. She gained physical stamina. She grew accustomed to back-breaking work. At the same time, she relied on her faith to get her through the day. She would need the strength of body and mind to realize her own destiny. Armenta's father's owner died in 1836, and Ben Ross was granted his freedom several years later. He stayed on a plantation through working as a timber inspector. Armenta wanted more. She wanted to run free. She wanted her whole family to run free. She wanted all slaves to run free.
Right. Okay, Chapter 1, Visions North. Armenta Ross married John Tubman, a free black man, in 1844. She took her husband's surname, and around that time she also changed her first name to Harriet, after her beloved mother. The laws at that time outlawed any marriage between a slave and a free black. Instead, it was considered an informal arrangement. The slave's owner could completely ignore it. That also meant that the slave and any of the slave's children could be sold at whim, since a child born to a slave was automatically put into bondage. However, after her father gained his freedom in 1840, Tubman wanted to explore her own status. She believed that her mother may have mistakenly been kept a slave after her first owner died. In 1845, she hired a lawyer and he investigated the matter. The lawyer and other white authorities determined that her mother, Harriet Ross, could have been freed when she turned 45. But because Tubman's mother had been passed as property from owner to owner, it was unclear whether she could still be freed. Tubman nevertheless vowed to free herself. To do so would involve a long, dangerous journey to the north. Tubman's heroic acts have been memorialized through art, including this 12th century painting by an African American artist, William H. Johnson. He emphasizes the North Star as her guiding force. Powerful dreams guiding visions. Tubman had visions or dreams she thought were sending her clear messages of freedom. They came to her while she was fully awake. One vision in particular depicted men on horseback galloping to round up slaves. Ear-piercing shrieks and the clapping of horse hooves filled her ears. It was an unforgettable nightmare, but she also had vivid visions of flying across fields and mountains, seeing women in white who would pull her across the landscape. Off and running. By 1849, Tubman feared being sold farther south. She had heard her brothers might be sold too. She prayed her owner would be more Christian and set them free. When she saw no evidence of that, she prayed for his death. She believed he had no legal right to keep her and her family in slavery. Her prayer seemed to be answered when her owner suddenly died that year. But her owner's death put her at a crossroads. She asked herself many questions about how her mother and brothers and sisters would get along. Would the entire family now be split up? Would she be sold and separated from her husband? Tubman knew she had to take an active role in her own destiny. She was entitled to liberty or death, and she would take whichever one came to her. She left her husband in the fall of 1849 and traveled at night on foot. Most fugitives were men, but Tubman had the strength of a man. Her owner's widow posted an advertisement offering a $100 reward for her return. As she made her way through Delaware into Pennsylvania, she received help from the Underground Railroad. Tubman was so grateful for the assistance. She gave one helpful woman a treasured homemade quilt. Finally, she arrived safely in Philadelphia and started a new life in freedom. She later described the moment when she finally crossed into free territory. When I found I had crossed the line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came out like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. Oh, picture. No, that's a different picture. I didn't because it's something else. I didn't read that. Chapter 2, Let My People Go. Historians still debate the origin of the Underground Railroad. One account refers to a story about a Kentucky slave in 1831. He escaped his master. He had taken an Underground Railroad. Another account appeared in 1839 when a Washington, D.C. reporter wrote in a local newspaper about a tortured slave who revealed he was supposed to go north on an Underground Railroad to Boston, Massachusetts. But some believe the Underground Railroad began as early as 1810. This secret network was formed by individuals who were unhappy with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Whatever the origin, the Underground Railroad was real, although it was neither underground nor a railroad. The Underground Railroad adopted railroad terms. Slaves were called freight or cargo. Routes were called lines. A stopping place was a station, and people who had runaways along the Underground Railroad were called conductors. An organized escape system that operated by word of mouth. The railroad helped slaves from the South escape to the northern states in Canada. The networks of routes extended in all directions through 14 northern states from Maine to Nebraska and helped between 40,000 to 100,000 slaves out of 3.5 million slaves reach freedom. The exact number is too difficult to pinpoint because the railroad operated in extreme secrecy. It kept few records. Although only a small group of Northerners participated, the railroad stirred Northern sympathy for the slaves. This convinced many Southerners that the North would not allow slavery to continue for much longer. When Harriet Moses Tubman appeared at a slave's door, there was no time to waste. The time to run was now. One of the pictures. Answering the call to duty. Although Philadelphia, Pennsylvania boasted a large community of free blacks, Tubman could not stop thinking about all those left behind in the South. She knew she would have to go back and bring as many people as she could to safety. She appeared mysteriously out of the night at slave cabins on plantations where anxious freedom seekers awaited her. They waited for Moses Tubman's code name. Tubman worked closely with the Underground Railroad. All the wages she had earned when she was working as a maid in hotels and the clubs in Philadelphia were poured into her rescue operations. Tubman knew the risk involved. She had to exercise strict discipline. If anyone in her care decided to take a rest or a dropout and return to slavery, she pulled out her revolver. She forced them to pull their weary bodies from the ground and continue the long, treacherous journey. Shown with the rifle in the circa 1865 portrait, Tubman meant business on their dangerous trek north. Fleeing, fleeing slaves had to obey her rules. That's the picture of her right there. The Fugitive Slaves Act. The first American law involving slavery was passed in 1793. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act. This law made it a crime to give refuge to an escaped slave or to interfere with his or her arrest. It allowed capture and return even if the slave escaped to another state or United States territory. In 1850, a new stricter law was passed as part of a set of compromises made with the South. The law now penalized federal marshals who refused to enforce the law and individuals who helped slaves escape. If caught, fugitives would not be able to testify in court on their own behalf. They also would not be permitted a jury trial. This law was so severe that it intensified the abolitionist movement. The acts were finally repealed in 1864 near the end of the Civil War. Go down, Moses. Slave catchers were always close behind. Now faced with the consequences of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Tubman and her followers were in greater peril than ever. She had to reroute her efforts from New York, her usual destination, to Canada. She had to take extra measures to keep everyone in her care safe. By 1856, there was a $40,000 reward for her capture. By comparison, an average worker around that time earned only about $300 a year. Finding and capturing Tubman could make someone quite rich. With danger at every turn, Tubman carefully planned her journeys. Although she could neither read nor write, she was brilliant at considering options and alternatives. Read this photo. Refugees on the run were prepared to make a bold stroke for freedom against slave catchers, as shown in this engraving from William Still's 1872 book about the Underground Railroad. In this painting, smiling faces and hands in prayer distinguish former slaves as Tubman delivers them to freedom in Canada. Tubman's revolver hangs at her waist. Okay. You read the last page? You read the last page? That's the end of chapter 2.
She knew she could only lead her people part of the way. She left fugitives in care of other Underground Railroad conductors. One of her signals to friendly forces that danger was in the area, "Oh, go down, Moses,"
was singing.
"Oh, go down, Moses," way down the Egypt's land. Tell old
Pharaoh
let my people go. She made 19 dangerous journeys to the south over the course of 8 years. Eventually, she guided her parents and most of her brothers and sisters to safety of the north. All told, she may have delivered 300 people out of slavery. She said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." In Canada, American laws could not be enforced. Slave catchers had no authority there. The former slaves should be safe and free. Tubman herself settled the Ontario, Canada, from a while until her next duty called her into action.
Chapter 3, General Tubman. Even when not physically leading her people out of slavery, Tubman did not rest or give up her cause. She spoke at meetings and assemblies for abolitionists and women's rights supporters. To ensure slave hunters could not find her, she often concealed her name. For instance, at one talk in Boston in 1859, she used the name Harriet Garrison, fusing her name with that of the well-known abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. She developed a network of friends who were known anti-slavery advocates. They were writers, publishers, speakers, and politicians, but most of all, they were people of action, just like Tubman. She became their fierce ally and lifelong friend. As she looked forward to the day of emancipation for all slaves, she decided she needed to bring her family out of Canada. It was time to make a more direct attack on slavery. This 1940 drawing shows Tubman as a powerful public speaker against slavery and for women's rights, a role she found necessary and satisfying. Satisfying. Women's rights. By the mid-19th century, a call for women's rights emerged in the United States. In 1848, a conference of women and men gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, to issue a declaration advocating for these rights. Led by anti-slavery leader Lucretia Mott and legal expert Elizabeth Cady Stanton, attendees debated and crafted a list of grievances concerning educational, vocational, economic, and religious inequalities. Changes in the law would be necessary to balance the equality between women and men. This convention launched the women's rights movement that lasted into the 20th century. After voting rights were finally granted to Black males, abolitionist Susan B. Anthony of Rochester, New York, thought women ought to have that right too. She helped to form the National Women's Suffrage Association. She, Stanton, and colleagues Lucy Stone traveled the country to advocate for women's rights to vote. Women gained this hard-earned right in 1920 through the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Many of these early fighters also opposed slavery. At the New York State Women's Suffrage Association in 1904, leader Susan B. Anthony introduced Tubman and held her hand. In freedom, Tubman became a passionate fighter for women's rights. Her efforts became legendary. The General and John Brown. No one within Tubman's circle could have had a more direct attack in mind than white abolitionist John Brown, whom Tubman met in 1858. He was a determined, even fanatical fighter against slavery. Brown believed slavery was a sin against Christianity. He also believed bloodshed was necessary to end slavery. In October 1859, Tubman assisted him in planning for his attack on the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. In admiration, Brown dubbed her General Tubman. She promised Brown that many of the former slaves she had freed would join. Only illness brought on by her skull injury prevented her from fighting alongside Brown during the raid. Brown's meager army held out until his capture. Half of his recruits, including two of his sons, were killed in the fight with local militia. Brown was tried and found guilty of treason, murder, and inciting slaves to rebellion. He was hanged, but his actions brought him reverence, and historians now believe his raid helped to hasten the Civil War. Okay.
I'll read this page.
Okay.
I'm actually excited for this page.
Okay.
And signpost in Auburn, New York, memorializes Tubman's home, calling her the Moses of her people. Her home became a haven for refuge slaves. Refugees. That's Harriet Tubman.
Yes.
Harriet Tubman's home. Struggles at home in Auburn. In Auburn, New York, Tubman found a circle of anti-slavery advocates too. The city served as a station for the Underground Railroad. Senator William Stewart, long against slavery, and later President Lincoln, Secretary of State, lived there. When Tubman wanted a house of her own, he offered her one she could afford. She moved to Auburn in 1857. She brought her parents from Canada to live with her. She may have considered giving up her role as conductor of the railroad and instead look for her new home to serve as a station, and she the station master. So many slaves still needed the help toward freedom. Close to home, one of these was Charles Nally, who had escaped to upstate New York from Virginia in 1858. The slave catcher caught up to him in 1860, and now Nally was being held from federal authorities in Troy. Tubman hatched a plan. She disguised herself as an elderly woman in order to gain access to Nally and help him flee from custody. When he was brought out into the streets where a large crowd had gathered, despite receiving several blows to her head from officers, she ushered Nally through the crowd into a boat waiting nearby. But authorities soon recaptured him. Tubman had to try again. She found out that he had been taken. Then the help of local citizens were both black and white. She stormed the house and managed to get Nally out onto a wagon heading west to
Schenectady,
New York. New York. Money was later raised on Nally behalf to purchase.
Okay, you gotta keep speaking when they can hear you. Can't fade off. Chapter 4. Serving her country. Who else might need the services of the General Tubman? After the first shots of the Civil War were fired over Fort Sumter, South Carolina in April 1861, she would soon find out. Moses of the underground rises above ground. Tubman served the Union Army during the Civil War. She nursed and cooked for both whites and blacks. Given her wide array of skills, she was at first vastly underutilized. But through the recommendations of prominent friends, eventually she was tapped to put a spy network in place. She knew all about secret networks through her work with the Underground Railroad. By early 1863, she was given a job to scout out and map regions in South Carolina. She served as official commander of her men. She led her raiding parties in Confederate territory as a woman named Moses. And as a spy, she provided strategic information about the Confederacy's position and its strengths and weaknesses. Her scouting and spying came together in June 1863. She waited in darkness as Union gunboats moved through South Carolina. This was just like all those journeys she had made under the noses of slave owners and slave catchers to bring slaves to freedom. Now she guided the ships in their raid to seize torpedoes and empty warehouses. She also emptied plantations, and 750 slaves boarded the federal gunboats with the help of 150 black soldiers. She was the first woman ever to lead an armed military raid. Moses had risen from the underground. Thank you. But by spring 1864, Tubman requested to leave and return to her home. Her health was failing and she was worried about her elderly parents. She arrived in Auburn in the summer of 1864 with military transport all the way from South Carolina. She connected again with local friends there and in Boston. After several months at home, she was refreshed and ready to return to military duty. She joined the Union forces of Virginia, again tending to the injured and sick. Soon after, however, the Confederacy surrendered and President Lincoln signed the constitutional amendments to abolish slavery. A life in print. Let me read this first. In July 1863, Union Army gunboats targeted the area in South Carolina where the slave cabins stand. Tubman helped save more than 700 slaves from this plantation. And this is a picture of that right there. Okay. A Life in Print. The first biography written about Harriet Tubman was published in 1869. Her friend Sarah Hopkins Bradford wrote it to help raise money for Tubman's support. They had met when Tubman returned home in Auburn in the summer of 1864. Without the pay for her war service, Tubman fell on hard times. To write the book, Bradford relied on her conversations with Tubman. She also gathered documents including testimonies from participants in abolitionist and Underground Railroad activities. Some historians believe the volume was hastily written and published, as Bradford was preparing for a trip to Europe. A second version was published in 1886 as a result of Tubman's needs for money to establish a shelter for aging African Americans. In this revision, now titled Harriet Tubman, the Moses of Her People, Bradford sought to elevate Tubman's speech to standard English. Historians have studied the two different editions and debate whether either one reflects Tubman's truth. Nelson Davis joins the Auburn household. Tubman met Nelson Davis in South Carolina during the war. Davis had escaped from slavery in North Carolina and found haven in New York State. He joined the New York 8th Regiment and in 1864. His unit moved south. After the war, he made his way to Auburn and Tubman's house where she helped to recover from tuberculosis. Tubman often took in other blacks who needed food, shelter, and medical help. He no doubt helped her deal with the news of her husband John Tubman's murder by a white man in Maryland in the fall of 1867. She focused on running her household and taking care of people boarding with her. Soon, Davis and Tubman decided to marry. Unlike her first wedding, this one was recorded and took place in church in 1869. They were married until his death in 1888. Post-war struggles. Tubman's military successes went largely unnoticed. Even on the journey home, a New Jersey train conductor did not believe she was a returning soldier, and he threw her into the baggage car. She knew tough struggles lay ahead. One of these struggles was trying to collect her back pay of $1,800. The United States government refused to recognize her war service. It passed a law allowing war widows to claim a pension. Tubman applied for the pension in its usual amount of $8 per month. The United States Congress debated her application. Both the House of Representatives and the United States Senate wanted to give her more, but they had trouble agreeing on the amount. Finally, in 1899, President William McKinley signed her $20 monthly pension into law. Wow. Harriet Tubman's legacy. Tubman's health continued to plague her, yet she worked to support 2 schools for freed blacks in the South. She also continued to provide a home for her parents. At the same time, she devoted herself to women's suffrage and frequently attended meetings. Tubman knew how to tell a story and to keep her audience riveted. She was sought after as a public speaker, but money was a persistent problem. Her final years.
Her final years, with more and more people living under her roof while she tended with them, and with her commitments to schools and shelters, Tubman had to borrow money for food. She must have taken comfort in her shelter for elderly blacks. When its doors finally opened in Auburn in 1908, it was help and generosity of those around her allowed Tubman to help blacks with nowhere else to go. Her effort in the Tubman's
Go to finish that
in the
efforts.
In the name of charity made her role model in local eyes. Following her example, a home for black women opened in Boston bearing her name. Even after the turn of the 20th century, Tubman could be seen heading to Auburn train station to attend the suffrage meeting elsewhere in New York State.
A legend lives on. Tubman died in Auburn on March 10, 1913, and was buried with military honors. She had already been made into a legend through newspaper and magazine articles and books written about her, as well as her own public appearances. At the core of her fame, of course, lay her role in risking her life to save other slaves. A statue was erected in Battle Creek, Michigan, where fellow former slave and abolitionist Sojourner Truth had lived. Another statue appeared in Boston a year later after her death. The city of Auburn unveiled a plaque on the Cayuga County Courthouse in her memory. Each year on Memorial Day weekend in May, people come to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Auburn to honor Tubman's life and achievements. The Harriet Tubman House, now owned by this church, has become a museum and education center. Another museum has been erected in Cambridge, Maryland, close to where Tubman was born. This museum celebrates March 10th as Harriet Tubman Day. A garden was planted alongside Cambridge's highway and named the Harriet Tubman Memorial Garden. Show the pictures. Okay. To dedicate this garden in 2000, people made a pilgrimage from Maryland to New York to commemorate Tubman's many journeys. In Ontario, Canada, where she and her parents lived for a while, there is now a research facility at York University named Harriet Tubman Resource Center on the African American diaspora. In addition, the church Tubman attended in Canada placed a historical marker to remember her. Many public schools bear Tubman's name. Year after year, school children learn about her by watching her. Excuse me.
The play freedom.
Okay. Okay. Myth or fact?
Myth or fact? In many ways, Harriet Tubman appears larger than life. Her journeys have been made unrealistic, especially in books for children. Historians now believe that Tubman's journeys were more complicated and dangerous than originally thought. However, she did not travel throughout the South saving slaves. She returned to Maryland and to plantations she knew. Many stories describe Tubman's using quotes and codes sewed into them to guide slaves to the north. Tubman did not follow any secret quote codes. Instead, the Willie Tubman used her wits, the shape of the river and the stars to show her the way. She also altered to tempos in spiritual songs such as Go Down Moses and Bond for the Promised Land. Using the songs delivered message to passengers on the Underground Railroad, making the sound of owls.
You need to stop at that period. We're not together. Start that right there.
Making the sound of an owl was another one of her signals. Another myth is that she started the Underground Railroad. While she didn't start it, Tubman helped expand the already existing network and became its most famous conductor. Tubman herself, however, was more proud of her work than with the Union Army.
Okay. Thank you. Moses of her people. Although perhaps a mythical figure to many, Harriet Tubman was a real-life Moses for hundreds of former slaves. Thousands of African Americans today can trace their families' freedom to Tubman. There are also those who are descended from soldiers she helped while serving in the Union Army, and those she housed at the Auburn shelter. Tubman's fierce determination helped her beat the odds against her. Whether she was facing the bounty placed on her head by slave owners, the threat of Confederate capture, or the financial challenges involved in her later efforts to provide for others and to stand up for what was right. Tubman is proof that one woman can make a tremendous difference and change the course of history. Okay, and that is the end of our book for today. Go ahead.
I hope you guys enjoyed this book. We read Harriet Tubman, and I hope you guys all enjoy this book. So tomorrow we're going to be reading Buzzing with the Questions, The Inquisitive Mind of Charles Henry Turner. So I'm actually excited for this book tomorrow. Yeah. And I'm going to do a shout out. So today's shout outs is Miss Sandy, Mrs. D. Williams,
Okay.
Shanika Jackson, and James Beaver, my uncle.
Uncle.
Good morning. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed today's video.
Okay, like she said, tomorrow we will be on day 15 and we will be reading Buzzing with Questions there. And this is The Inquisitive Mind of Charles Henry Turner. Okay, so hope you guys can join us tomorrow for tomorrow's read for day 15. Thank you guys so much for joining and watching.
Bye.
Bye.